Before I start, I'm going to have kind of a laugh at myself in light of my interchange with Linda about getting things out there. The talk today, I have managed to share some of these findings recently in New Zealand at the Human Rights Commission's Diversity Forum. On the other hand, I have a wonderful former postdoc, Anne-Marie Masgaret, who works for Immigration New Zealand. She asked me if I'd come and talk to them. I said, oh yeah, I've really got some interesting things on multiculturalism. She came back to me rather shamefaced soon after and said, I was told that in the year of the election, we have no business talking about multiculturalism. So we can't always get it out there. And actually, that was the basis of a question I asked Vicky yesterday, which was, how do you get government to listen? Anyway, so today, multiculturalism. Yeah, multiculturalism. Cause of social problems, cure for social ills. Well, multiculturalism has been pronounced a failure in Europe over the last decade. In fact, many people would say it's dead and we're now in a post-multicultural era. I'm going to change that. I'm going to challenge that. But, pose the question, how is it that this apparent failure in Europe is contrasted with apparent success as experienced in Canada or in Australia? Don't go back to where you came from, or even in New Zealand. This picture being from Wellington, where I live, which says diversity, yes, racism, no, from Multicultural Aotearoa, which is the Māori name for New Zealand. I think part of the reason we have these debates and disagreements about multiculturalism is because we aren't talking about the same thing. We have a major problem with understanding and defining it. So I'm going to have a specific definition. You may say it's a challenge definition because it goes beyond just having cultural diversity. My thinking about multiculturalism is influenced very much by John Berry, but I would say that multiculturalism essentially has three components. Obviously, first you have to have the cultural diversity apparent. But it's not just about the diversity, it's also about policies. So you can talk about multicultural policies, and you can talk about multicultural ideology. And each of these three components, I have to hang qualifiers on. So yes, we have to have cultural diversity, but it's not just a question of having different groups. If you're aiming for a multicultural society, the groups have to be in contact with each other. So it's not like, oh yeah, it's great, go be Chinese over there. Or, go be Muslim over there. So you have to have the groups in interaction. Secondly, you have to manage this diversity, and to do that, you need multicultural policies. These are policies that support integration. And by integration, I mean what we've been talking about today, both cultural maintenance and equitable participation. And thirdly, it's important to think about a multicultural ideology. And that's the view that diversity is valuable and it should be accommodated. So I think if we really want to talk about multiculturalism, it has to have these three components. So I would venture to say, and John and I agree vigorously on this, multiculturalism hasn't failed in Europe. It's never been there. It's never happened. Now, I don't want to just suggest to you that, bang, one day a country becomes truly multicultural in these terms, because it is a journey. It may be an aspirational destination. I'm not sure any of us have really gotten there, but I think these are the major, really important components. So if you agree, and you may not, that these are the components of multiculturalism, what might the consequences of each of these dimensions be? Now, political scientists and sociologists have tended to study these factors, these dimensions, looking at macro-level, societal-level data, and they may look at how diversity in terms of fractionalization impacts trust, or how national-level ideologies predict various reactions or behaviors towards immigrants, this type of thing. But as psychologists, I think we're interested in the experience of multiculturalism. What is it like in our everyday basis? And how do we perceive our own environment, whether it's at the national level or perhaps an institutional organizational level? How do we perceive this environment in terms of these three dimensions? So we have started to talk about a new construct that we are temporarily calling subjective multiculturalism. And so here we're talking about the individual's perceptions concerning the degree to which their society is diverse, so that the diversity is evident, valued, and accommodated. I pause here because I'm not completely satisfied with the label we're using for this construct now. So I'm really happy to invite comment on a better term. I've thought maybe perceived multiculturalism. I've thought of other things, but we haven't. The first paper is on the verge of submission, and I didn't want to let it go until I had this session with you. So I hope that you can give us some feedback. Anyway, so we're looking at, from a psychological point of view, the same three dimensions. We're looking at interacting with diversity, multicultural policies and practices, and also multicultural ideology. So I'll start off with telling you a little bit about the scale that we constructed to tap these constructs. We started in New Zealand, where, just by way of background, 1 in 4 people in New Zealand are overseas born. That would include me. We had 35 items that I'm skipping here. I'm looking at the wrong part of the screen here. Over 300 New Zealand residents that participated. We recruited these through various social networks, online forum. And they completed an online survey. About 56% were New Zealand Europeans, so we have an ethnically mixed sample, and in this sample, 58% were New Zealand born. The survey that completed, we had 35 items that we generated for the pool for our subjective multiculturalism scale, reflecting the diversity, policy, and ideology dimensions. And for our criterion measures, we had assessments that tapped awareness of discrimination and disadvantage. We had measures of multicultural attitudes, and we had measures of national attachment. Now, this is what we were hoping for in terms of validating the scale. So we were looking for multicultural policies and practices to be negatively associated with perceived minority disadvantage and discrimination. So that's the structural discrimination scale and the ethnocultural empathy scale, which is an odd name for that measure. Essentially, it means having an empathy, awareness, or understanding for the disadvantage experienced by various minority groups. We anticipated that multicultural ideology should be associated with one's own multicultural attitudes and attitudes towards diversity. We had a little bit more challenge coming up with what we thought could function as a decent criterion measure for the interacting with diversity, but there is some evidence, at least for minority groups, that interactions across cultural boundaries is associated with a stronger national identity. So we speculated that we would find a small but significant relationship between interacting with diversity and national attachment or national identity. Okay, after doing our exploratory factor analysis, this gives you some idea what our 17-item measure looks like. So you can see multicultural policies. I should say that these items are prefaced by, in New Zealand, blah, 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 or in wherever, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so in New Zealand, institutional practices are often adapted to the specific needs of ethnic communities, or ethnic minorities are given the opportunities to communicate in their native language. So these are meant to reflect multicultural policies and practices. Multicultural ideology is about what most people think about diversity. So that multiculturalism is a bad thing, or that the country's unity is weakened by people from different cultural backgrounds. And then finally, the interaction with diversity is about most people's experience in your country. So children go to school with other children from different ethnic backgrounds, or you work with people from different backgrounds, this type of thing. So these were our three factors. And in New Zealand, we found that we did get the correlations that we were looking for. Now, there are many correlations in this table. I've highlighted the ones that we have selected as our criterion measures, and you can see that when you believe your country has more multicultural policies and practices, this is associated with lower levels of perceived structural discrimination and less empathetic awareness, meaning you don't think that minorities are experiencing hardship and disadvantage. When you believe that people value diversity in terms of multicultural ideology, your own attitudes towards diversity and multicultural attitudes are positively associated with that. And then to a lesser extent, but still significant, we found that interacting with diversity was associated with stronger national identity and pride. Now, there are many correlations in this table, and what you will find in general in this table, that the three factors of multiculturalism are associated with positive outcomes in the way you would expect, with the exception, if you look here, we see that the more multicultural policies and practices, the weaker one's endorsement of multiculturalism in terms of your own attitudes. So hold on to that finding, because we're going to revisit that in upcoming studies. Now, having done this in New Zealand, we wanted to replicate, and so we took it to the United States, recruited 271 US residents, about 3/4 of whom were white. We did this again through various online fora, and they completed exactly the same survey, except for, obviously, it was targeted to the United States. So we were able to replicate the factor structure, and we found the same patterns of correlations with respect to our criterion measures. The one difference being the relationship between interacting with diversity and national pride, while low and positive, in this case was not statistically significant. So we have a nice replication, and we also find in this sample that the more America is seen to have multicultural policies and practices, the less I am likely to endorse multiculturalism or have positive attitudes towards diversity. This plants the seed, maybe multicultural policies and practices, like trying to let the other guy participate in a fair and equitable way on an equal playing, the playing field being equal, maybe that's threatening, and we will investigate that momentarily. But the first study, after we had the scale in hand, you can go, okay, so what? Well, what's it good for? And what essentially we're interested in, because a lot of the discourse about multiculturalism being a bad thing, is that it's very bad for social cohesion. It has negative consequences. It disrupts the State of the Union, so to speak. So we were interested in looking at how this subjective multiculturalism would relate to some indicators of social cohesion. And we were also interested in, because we think it's important when you try to come to terms with, is multiculturalism a good thing or a bad thing, or is it associated with social problems or fixing social problems? Part of the question also has to be, for whom? Because it can operate differently depending on what group you come from. So we went back to the United States, and these are data from Sarah Watter's master's thesis. Sarah came to us in New Zealand from Maryland, and she was very interested in looking, obviously, at her own country. And so we recruited 284 US residents, pretty much equally split between whites and Hispanics. slightly more females, mostly US born, mostly citizens. And they completed an online survey where we looked at some background information, age, ethnicity, birthplace, citizenship, and political orientation. We looked at the subjective multiculturalism scale, and as you can see on the slide, the alphas were pretty good for both the Hispanics and the whites. And we selected only 2 measures that could be considered indicative of social cohesion, and that was patriotism and interpersonal trust. I say patriotism, I suppose that may not normally be thought of as socially cohesive particularly, but part of the argument is if you allow these immigrants to keep their own culture, they're not going to be patriotic and loyal to the national culture. So patriotism is a very contentious issue with respect to multiculturalism. So what I'm going to do next is show you the regression equations predicting trust and patriotism. Before we conducted these, we did test for measurement invariance, and we were able to establish metric equivalence for all of the measures between whites and Hispanics. And now when we look at predicting trust and patriotism, let's look at trust first. We find, okay, older people and white people are more trusting. We see that multicultural ideology exerts a significant effect on trust, so that the more you believe your country values diversity, the more likely you are to trust other people in your country. However, you'll see, after we entered the personal background factors, the subjective multiculturalism indicators, and then the interactions with ethnicity, that we do find a significant interaction for this effect of ideology, which I will show you in a minute. When we look at patriotism, we find somewhat different outcomes. Older people and conservatives are more patriotic. But in this case, each of the 3 aspects of subjective multiculturalism exerts a positive effect on patriotism. So the more interaction, perceived interaction with diversity, the stronger perceived multicultural policies and practices, and the more you see your country as holding a multicultural ideology, the stronger that ideology, the more patriotic you are. But you'll see, again, that the ideology effects are moderated by ethnicity. Now I'm about to pop up the graphs for that, but would anybody like to guess what the interaction is going to look like? Because I think you probably can. All right. Essentially, multicultural ideology is only exerting a significant effect for Hispanics. So the more Hispanics as a minority group believe that their country values diversity, the more trusting they are and the more patriotic. Okay, so that was our first little jaunt into do these elements of multiculturalism make a difference? Our next one, and these are the data that I think, like many others, I was analyzing on my way across the ocean. We took it out to Britain and examined whites and Indians, and we expanded our repertoire of dependent variables. So 375 UK residents, 250 white British, and 125 Indians. They completed this online survey where we also introduced well-being into the mix. So we had 3 measures of well-being: flourishing, positive and negative affect, along the lines of Diener's positive psychology work. And we had additional indicators of social cohesion. So going beyond patriotism and trust, we added civic action, belonging, perceived discrimination, and perceived threat. Broadly, the descriptive statistics here. You can see, again, the alphas, the reliability held up pretty well. We also established metric equivalence between the British whites and Indians. I'm just seeing that my slide slipped a little bit on this one. It's white Indian, if you want the headings. And here's the results for flourishing. And what we see here, British Indians reported greater flourishing. And we see that interacting with diversity contributed to or exerted a positive effect on flourishing, and that it was moderated by ethnicity. And here's what it looked like. Essentially, the effect of of interacting with diversity was positive for both whites and for Indians, but you can see the slope is steeper for Indians. For patriotism, here we find that perceived multicultural policies exert a positive influence on patriotism. Again, Indians were more patriotic than whites. We have another interaction effect. In this case, multicultural ideology the effects of multicultural ideology is moderated by ethnicity and looks like this. So we have borderline significance for whites. When whites believe that the society has a stronger multicultural ideology, they are more patriotic. The effect for Indians is insignificant. I just realized I failed to mention when I showed the flourishing slide. We got the same effects for positive and negative affect, except for in those cases there was no interaction. So the main effects remain the same. The one more slide I'm going to show you with the regressions is going back to that notion of threat, because I suggested that it may be the case that multicultural policies and practices are threatening for the majority group. And if you have a look here, you see that while multicultural policies and practices are associated with greater perceived threat, conversely, multicultural ideology predicts lower levels of threat. But when you add in the interaction terms, you find multicultural policies and practices is moderated by ethnicity and exactly the way you would expect. All right, so they are more threatening for whites, and that is significant. But multicultural policies tends to diminish perceived threat by Indians, although that's only borderline significant. In terms of further results, like I said, I'm not going to bombard you with more tables, but we found for every one of the dependent measures, we did have some positive effects of an aspect of subjective multiculturalism, as you can see on the slide. We started with the general idea that we would have positive consequences, but because the work in social science, which has looked at these dimensions, tends to look at them in isolation. They look at only one. We weren't sure what would happen when you put the three together, which is, of course, how things pan out in real life. All right, so the bottom line here is this. Multiculturalism is complex and multifaceted. All three components are associated with positive well-being and or social cohesion in some ways, and we do have some support for the cure of social ills, although obviously it's not causative, it's not causal. Multiculturalism can pan out in different ways depending on which group you're talking about and which national context. But with the exception of the association between multicultural policies and perceived threat in whites, there's no evidence that multiculturalism is the cause of social problems. And so obviously the limitations, it's cross-sectional survey data. We have longitudinal data in hand yet untouched and not analyzed. This is with Seth Schwartz. We have some in our heads and not yet on paper ideas about how to turn this into experimental research. Want to expand the cultural context. And my dream study, which I have no money for, is to actually do a massive international cross-cultural study where we look at the objective archival data and then look at the subjective data in surveys along with well-being and social cohesion indicators. So thank you very much.